Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Dennard Dayle, author of the novel How to Dodge a Cannonball. Denard, hi.
Hey, how are you feeling?
I'm great. I'm really excited to talk to you about this book. Um, First thing I want to know, and forgive me for my ignorance, I've heard of flag bearers, but I'm not aware of flag twirlers. Is that something you made up, or is that a real position that people had in the U.S. Civil War?
That is a great question. It is entirely made up. It is simply a riff on the general cadet lifestyle, flag bearers, bugle boys, that kind of thing. I thought that it was a nice bit of absurdity for me to insert. The kind of thing I like about its role throughout the narrative is that I have a lot of physical performance experience in my backdrop. I've done some dancing stuff, some skateboarding stuff, etc. And it kind of lets me create a bit of, I guess, very, I don't know, minute personal feeling of absurdity by drawing from that vocabulary in this entirely as different as possible context.
Well, let's talk about that entirely as different as possible context, because here we have the U.S. Civil War, a watershed event in this nation's history, and it led to a lot of changes. It was a very kind of necessary thing that had many years of historical context leading up to it. And here you have this 15-year-old kid who is really determined to be the best flag twirler he can be, and he's just kind of figuring things out as he goes along and kind of stumbling his way through. So, talk about that juxtaposition and what the meaning is behind portraying the U.S. Civil War in that manner.
Sure. So I have, for various reasons that are probably obvious, been thinking a lot about information overload the last 4 years. And in my personal writing, something that I found very useful for coming at it was the Civil War is this immensely complicated, loaded, deeply felt on all sides conflict, to this day, to the people, including people who like reflect on it. And I kind of like the idea of approaching this idea of information overload or trying to parse your way through something that's bigger than you, complicated, overwhelming in the moment through someone who is, I mean, the entire 12 to 17 tax bracket is like mentally as chaotic as it gets, obviously. And I liked the idea, both personally and comedically, of someone trying to sort through something this loaded, this complicated, with all the associations that someone growing up in the period would have. And he's obviously, this particularly bent kind of personality. He goes through all these defections, and he has this very kind of mechanical intelligence. When it comes to writing a comedy, I never really like to write an out and out idiot. I think that kind of runs out of steam on page 30. What Anders is essentially dealing with is he is in the middle of this hugely thorny political conflict, and he has kind of this strong but limited and young kind of, I guess you'd say he's like sort of quantitatively smart kind of person. And he's just trying to piece this all together as it goes, and it is not going easily for him. So a big part again of me picking the Civil War, other than my own personal fixations, which obviously leads to a lot of what any author does anywhere, is this idea of trying to essentially find logic in a maelstrom. Your own information is already limited, and there's this wall of it coming at you. And that's kind of what Anders deals with. He's exposed to all these black soldiers for the first time, and he's trying to sort that out when he has been inside of sheltered is the wrong word because he is dealing with this immensely difficult personal story, but it's just an axis of life that he has not been exposed to at all. He might as well be on the other side of the planet from his perspective, and just trying to deal with that in motion while trying to survive, which is what most of us generally want to do. We are all generally pro our own survival. And oh, I'm sorry, was there a question?
Well, I mean, you've said a lot of very pertinent things there, but now I feel like I should back up a little bit because as we did said in the pre-interview there, I'm reading through it and I'm very curious to kind of get at the heart of the story. But maybe let's just frame it for those who haven't read the story. Who's Anders and what are his circumstances?
That is a great point. So Anders, again, we start out slightly pre-war. We essentially follow. There's one chapter with him at 7, then we jump to 15, right in the middle of 1863, Gettysburg, etc. And Anders is a teenager born in the Union in Illinois, and he essentially ends up getting captured, defecting to the Confederacy just as a matter of convenience and survival. And he ends up wrapped up in Pickett's charge because that's kind of my most loaded incident in history for the slightly deeply silly reason that I find it to be one of the more interesting or at least funnier kind of military disasters. I mean, obviously nothing is fun in and of itself about any kind of mass death. War is an ongoing rolling tragedy, but you end up with that sort of blackly comic situation where I guess there's something about the certainty that this maneuver to crush the center, run across, sprint across a mile, it's all going to work out. Everything's going to be different now. It has that kind of almost the producer's doomed shade to it that has always appealed to me. Anyway, he's involved in that and he defects again. And where the story really picks up is he ends up in a black regiment. He claims to be a quadroon named BK Jefferson. Obviously, we don't use that word today, but he spams that word all the time throughout the book because he is constantly nervous about being figured out. He's instantly figured out about half the time, but he bonds with them in some ways, doesn't bond with them in other ways, and gets wrapped up into all these other larger, crazier sort of sub conflicts within the war, some things entirely invented. And if I were to sort of pick at a central line, and you can see it in the ongoing defection gag, it is the idea of loyalty, the idea of what do you sort of owe two countries, two factions, to sort of establish relationships, balancing these things or balancing them very poorly, as Anders and other individuals often do. And then there's a lot in there about the nature of being a true believer, if you should, when that's helpful, and how that is often sort of played against you and various people. I suppose that kind of an intellectual root in my interest in both of those things is I think in a lot of our traditional casting of, Black people in this period, Black regiments in this period, there is this underlying and nobly intended kind of idea of like, and then they earned their freedom, or, you earn your freedom. And I always look at that sentence almost askance, like this idea that freedom is kind of a default state. It's sort of something you're born with. And the idea of earning it already kind of, tints your perspective, tints your attitude. And I kind of wonder if that is the, for lack of a better word, sanest perspective on that. And that's something I've always, again, found interesting. And was that a good amount of context, or?
Yeah, definitely. You brought up the black soldiers that Anders defects to. Can you talk about getting to know them yourself? Because as you just kind of mentioned, this isn't like Glory, and we don't have a Denzel Washington. The soldiers are kind of like just aware and accepting that this is the way things are, and not that they're not fighting for something, but they'll take what they can get, and they'll take it with good humor. Some of it may be exaggerated, but a lot of it feels very authentic. So can you talk about how you were able to draw out those characters, where you got your firsthand information, and just getting to know them yourself and putting them on the page?
Absolutely. So one thing I was kind of thinking about when it came to the different, the various soldiers in the Harriers, the sort of informal unit nickname is Harrow's Harriers after the vainglorious general that's leading them around and sort of watching the casualties from a distance. And I was kind of thinking a lot about the sort of range of human reactions you would find in this kind of situation. Like I have a few that are true believers. You have Tobias Gleason, who is this aspiring kind of playwright figure who becomes important as things go on. And you have also these very battered down, dealt with various shades of intense nonsense their entire life. You get a lot. That's where a lot of the Thomas kind of figures come from. He's a freeman up north who he has a bit of a drier, cynical attitude towards the whole thing. He's sort of a borderline Greek chorus kind of guy. But again, I like the idea of sort of exploring this spectrum of reactions. I think one of the ones he was almost actually the primary POV of this was Mole, who is this escaped slave who has developed almost this sort of twisted form of stoicism. And again, Gleason were sort of two people I had considered as rival primary POVs for the entire story. I ended up leaning in a bit more into the themes of sort of loyalty and true belief, so I kind of found Anders' multiple defections a bit more useful on that front. But when it comes to the black soldiers in the story, I almost kind of think of it as a sort of spectrum, basically between, like you said, the sort of take what you can get kind of thing that Mole kind of has in terms of his relationship to this war and all that it represents. And then Gleason, who almost has a borderline like contemporary understanding of the war and what they can try to get out of it. And in his head, this is about like earning a place in Americana, in American history. And he has this not wide-eyed because he has his own version of cynicism, only it's more oriented towards achieving this. But he has this very idealistic sepia version of how all this could turn out for them, and everyone else kind of fills in these notches that I think are interesting between those points. In terms of making things feel more lived in, obviously, when you go into a big project like this, you want to, first you do like you go back to the basic classics, the few documentaries, Battlefield Freedom, and you read a lot of your Frederick Douglass, etc. One thing I had a lot of fun with is the Library of Congress is just kind of a bottomless archive of primary documents, whether it's photos, letters, even these strange ads that were still printed around the time. And you can kind of fall down a very, I guess, entertaining for me rabbit hole just looking at these and trying to think about what their lives are like. In fact, when I ended up making a lot of sort of bonus promotional material for the book, I used a few of those photos in completely different contexts, like doing all these multimedia things. But that is honestly a great way to add color to it. I have a lot of love for that I mean, you probably know this because you are very obviously very connected with a lot of history, but uh David Blythe's like open lecture series on the Civil War. I have a lot of love for the way the information is laid out in that. And yeah, I guess I just kind of tried to go full immersion for about essentially the phases of writing this book where I always had a lot of background knowledge and interest in the entire Pickett incident in Gettysburg, etc. So I had a lot of the grounding for a lot of the first half of the novel just set already, and I kind of went in there as I was. And after I had written that chunk and decided, this is a book I'm going for, this is something I want to do, this is a project I believe in, I kind of entered more of an immersion period and expanding my horizons on the period, reading different things, getting immersed in those primary documents. One thing that I think will probably influence the next project, it's not a huge part of this because there's a lot of other stuff going on, but the spiritualist movement and a lot of the fever is the wrong word because obviously there's all kinds of religious fever in any period, but it has such a particular flavor that I find interesting. Like all these spirits, all these mediums that are running around the time, and it has this interesting overlap with certain shades of the abolitionist movement, but you can find a lot there to kind of love. But you had a question?
Wasn't this about the time when the photographers started finding ways to get spirits in the background of photos?
Oh yeah, everything that we would consider sort of a cheaty face, smoke and mirrors photography effect, they were just sort of running into and realizing, is this the next world? And it wasn't. You just kind of got to keep your lenses from fogging up. But it created some very interesting reactions, and there's always a enterprising con man in Americana willing to tap into that kind of
Yeah.
moment.
Well, you mentioned you went from a moment of curiosity and to a moment of making this into a real project. Uh, Tell me about as you dove into the research or dived in and decided to make this into a novel. How did you decide on your structure here? Because there's no traditional plot structure that I can see, um, and you chose to go with this absurdity, this humor. The cover image is a perfect example of that. There's no way he's dodging that cannonball. Uh, how did it all come together? Can you kind of describe the craft of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I definitely am someone that goes into a project with a ending in mind. I find it's just very helpful to me structurally. I do outline heavily, but I am not necessarily religiously committed to the path prescribed there. If I find some different energy mid-project, I will just try to reorient and re-outline. I do try to track the threads of information that way. One thing that I think influences how my stories are laid out a lot is that within the chapters, I tend to try to make it almost feel like you have come to a point at the end of each chapter that could be almost a short story or like a little self-contained arc. And I like that. I find that makes it feel a little more propulsive. It makes it a little easier for people to track things, especially if we go for something that's big and large and complicated. They can say, okay, I have ingested this unit. I can think about that for a minute and go about my day or what have you, without necessarily needing to, reel things back in too much. I really enjoy this is probably the influence of some of my work outside of my fiction, but I enjoy making all kinds of in-universe inserts and documents and conversations between chapters. Actually, reeled some of them in from my original draft idea. There's practically one between every chapter in my original sort of conception of this. And this time I wanted to, I suppose I thought it would be better for immersion if it was just every 3 or 4. And it's that kind of balancing act kind of thing. But when you look at this book, you'll see there are a lot of mock articles. There's this probably didn't spoil it, but there are a lot of things like mark articles, news reports, advertisements, speeches, etc., that come between chapters. And I find that's a nice way to move the lens without just sort of just completely jumping away from the characters or the primary POV you've chosen. I mostly sort of take that, classic third person bird on a shoulder kind of thing with Anders throughout most of the prose in this. But that's one way for me to vary it. But again, like I treat these individual chapters as these sort of complete discrete chunks, which gives me, I think, a little more leeway in the broader structure to wander a bit. I think there's a really strong influence of Catch 22 in this novel, which, if you're writing a war comedy in Americana and there is not a Catch 22 influence, you might just be slightly diluted, but it's definitely very conscious influence of mine. I've always loved Joseph Heller, Catch 22, Good as Gold, Closing Time, all that stuff. I've had my head very much in that kind of thing. And let's see what else. Again, I'm primarily Married to one mode. Oh, something I think about a lot when it comes to satire in particular is that, so I guess sometimes they call it like carnivalesque structure, but when you know that there's a certain point of chaos that you're building to, kind of just pacing out that spiral and making sure, even though where you're going or the human experience doesn't make sense, there's kind of an art to making the process feel sneaky or make sense in its own way. And that's kind of, if something is more mechanistically structured, that's something that I kind of go for. And you can kind of see that a bit in the arc of events, the way I treat his relationship to Gettysburg, the draft riots, etc. Into, I don't know how far along you are, but we get to a very strange territory by the end, and I try to essentially get that good boiling a frog feeling that you feel in a lot of the best satirical work. I think personally I've always thought that Miss Lonely Hearts is always really good with that, sort of making you think, wait, how did I get here? And another example is The Sellout, I think is kind of brilliant with that. And there is just a lot anyone can kind of learn structurally from, like, wait, I started out with this guy talking about his dad. How did I reach this complete bedlam? And I think there's an art to that, and I hope I've done well with it. But it's definitely something that was on my mind as I structured this.
Well, it's a structure I'm not all that familiar with, but it's interesting to hear you kind of described it. Well, you can go back and look at some of these other works of satire and kind of figure out what that structure is and how it works. I just speaking personally, the chapter with Anders and the dream, it went on and on and on, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I found it interesting because so many novels, including novels that I write, you put dreams in there because you can convey so much information through a dream than you can through reality, and it's just kind of a sneaky way to get stuff in there. But yours, I was like, it keeps going, and I was kind of surprised by that. Um, but I think that probably is more of a reflection of how dreams throughout the night. Uh,
So when you say dreams, are you talking later in the Mojave or earlier the sort of religious?
the religious part, yeah.
Oh yeah, I guess that's sort of the rubber stamp that me looking at so much of the kind of spiritualist fervor at the time, and conventional Christian mythos kind of has on a person, and I guess he's in such a mental pressure cooker, being in this war, being in the situation, being where he's from with his mother, that I kind of just enjoyed the dream as a way of just exploring the emotional aftershock of everything. I also am definitely someone that will probably chase, how do comedians put it, like sort of chase the bit as far as it goes. And I was having a lot of fun with him and how he sort of sees, the spectral half of life. And oh yeah,
Oh, no, nothing. I just, yeah, I mean, I was really engaged there and just found it incredibly fascinating. Well, let's talk about
thank you.
your path to publication. Yeah, I saw that you have a lot of writing credits, but I believe this is your debut novel. Is that right?
That is exactly right. I write a lot of short fiction and a lot of sort of comedic satirical nonfiction. I should say humor writing. I don't know. I write a lot of comedic essays. I write a lot of comedic fiction. I write some, obviously, non-jokey stuff too. And I think that I like doing a lot. I like keeping sort of a rotation of shorter stuff going because it kind of keeps me honest in terms of like just staying mentally engaged, my workload, making sure I'm trying to develop creatively. I've had the wonderful fortune of these these sort of web comedy veterans, Brockway and Sean Baby. They brought me onto this project of theirs that I almost think of as You know how a lot of the long form article websites on the web essentially had a great dying around the whole like pivot to video kind of thing last decade, unfortunate process. They have basically made what I would almost call it the Constantinople of web comedy with this site 1900 Hot Dog, which has a funny name, which goes into the form. But it is these long form humor essays every day of the week, and I have kind of felt extremely privileged to have a weekly slot there, and again, like those weekly essays have sort of kept me honest in a way. But the other thing I am regularly into is I do a lot of I guess you call them live installations. I've heard stunts, I've heard street art, graffiti. I kind of just think of them as fake signs, but I am sort of prone to that laconic Gordian not view of things from humor writing. I do things, a lot of civic signs, a lot of advertisements. I will essentially make these installations replacing the text, or I suppose the big claim to fame was during the last New York mayoral election. I made mock signs for every candidate because obviously there was a lot of political bedlam going on at the time. You have the ascent of Eric Adams. You have all these other figures sort of falling apart, particularly your Scott Stringers, etc. And I guess I'm always someone who has enjoyed injecting satire where and when I can. And I found that to be a mirthful opportunity for it. And through all kinds of complicated stuff that led to me doing these New Yorker shorts, which I also enjoy and still submit to, and all of that. I think that I suppose that a lot of the writers I've most admired over time, your Terry Pratchett's or Kurt Vonnegut's or whatever, I see that they have this huge block of work that they're so dedicated to adding consistently to. And I guess in my head, I'm thinking, okay, so maybe this is the kind of dragon I'm chasing. How far can I push that approach? I'm not saying I'm those guys. I don't have that ego, but if I were to say that there's like something that I'm running after, that is kind of the model of behavior, I suppose. I also, it helps a lot that I enjoy doing it. That's a good root thing to have. I like being able to spread my focus out a bit in terms of what's right or wrong with my head. I'm a big I guess you could call it like cross procrastination, in that there's definitely something over here I'm supposed to be doing, and I get this done, and it counts as a productive day in a sense.
So how about actually getting your novel published? Was there interest in your work because of everything you're putting out there, or did you have to go the traditional query, identifying an agent, uh, submitting to publishers, that kind of thing?
So my road to publication, I guess, business side was closer to the latter, the way you put it. I was querying agents. I was lucky enough to meet my current agent, Reese Hamilton, wonderful guy, while I was querying a completely different project. It was this sort of contemporary political satire about an election which was very prescient in many ways and would probably be a deeply painful read now in terms of how a lot of things have gone. But very interested in he was very interested essentially in me. He felt that particular project wasn't quite a fit, but if I had anything else, so I did have this collection, so I showed him this other collection I'd done a ways back, Everything Abridged, and we moved that, and that was a good process, I thought. And then I tried to be relatively not swift, but focus on putting this novel together. I tried not to. I don't know. I think it's easy to sort of fall into an inert pattern personally, so I tried to just sort of keep moving on the treadmill. And I wrote this. He was a big fan of the shape of it, and we went through a whole conventional querying process. And let's see, I don't know, how much are you supposed to say or not say about this tradition? I don't even know. You know, it doesn't matter. Forget traditionally. it went pretty well. It basically came down to like three people who were interested, and then they had whatever sword fight behind the scenes. He dealt with a lot of that, and we ended up at Holt working with Rita Powers, who has been kind of amazing in terms of I don't know. I think I've fit a relatively unique niche, and she just kind of instantly keyed into what I was going for and how she could work with that. And I guess I found that I don't know, very surprising because you know obviously when you work in all these different contexts, you learn what a lot of different working relationships are like. And when someone keys into so well something that is so particular, it almost feels like a small miracle. So I have been really lucky with this book at Holt. I'm thankful to them for that. I where was I going with this? So yeah, from there it was essentially I finished the book before I finished a version of the book before we tried to sell it. I think it's just easier to do. There's a lot of because it's you're selling something concrete, not just like the sort of pinky promise that you will be productive next year. And the revision process, we had a lot of runway, so I got a lot of time to tinker with things. It was to the book's overall benefit. I was very happy with a lot of like the lines of communication, and then relatively long run up to publication. So I sort of doubled down on short stuff in the interim, just to like build some momentum for it, and I think that has worked well for me. I'm also just, happy about how it looks on a general CV thing, which helps me do all the teaching and whatnot. And now it is coming out on the 17th. And I mean, I guess I couldn't really be more excited for, a first novel is both personally and creatively and in the weird business meta that I barely understand a big moment. And I suppose that was my road to making it happen.
Well, that's amazing. Congratulations. I think it is good to hear. I ask every author on the podcast kind of what their road was like. And some say, well, it's been a 25-year process. I had this many rejections. I had this many rewrites. It doesn't sound like your path is quite as rocky. It sounds actually pretty typical. Um, but I think that's good to share as well that you don't have to have 1,000 rejections to be a writer. And the fact that, like you said, you're lucky to find somebody at Holt that sees your vision or what you're trying to accomplish and have a good partner in that. I think as a publisher myself, anytime I can find a good publishing partner in the author, that's the goal. So congratulations on all of that.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I think that the flavor of these relationships changes so much about the process and how human it feels. And I'm sure, and obviously you're very plugged into that. And yeah, I do consider myself immensely lucky in a lot of ways. Like I guess my big journey to like that first query acceptance with Reeves, I did the whole, undergrad English major, graduate school, MFA, like very like laser side on trying to make this happen kind of thing. And when it when the acceptance came in, I was working actually. This was actually very conventional from like the 50s to the 80s. Like I was an advertising writer for a while, so I know I did the whole space merchants kind of thing. If you're a Corn Bluff fan, and I guess I felt immensely fortunate that at I guess I forgot how much time I was around the 29 when I got that when I got connected with Reeves, and at that young age, I felt very fortunate to have any kind of momentum. Like, well, young for writing, obviously like a football player or something would be like what, 29, but yeah, I felt very fortunate.
The last thing I'd like to ask is just about the overall message that you want to get to readers because this is a very unique work. I think it's a very important work to provide this sort of satire and absurdity to what's often an overglorified part of history. So, what can readers take away from what you've created?
Yeah, I think the bluntest core message is that in a maelstrom, in a whirlpool, it is very important to do what you can to stay sane and alive. And I think traditionally, like whether it's martial honor or certain perspectives on politics, it is very easy to lose that humanity, lose that prioritization of doing what you can for others and yourself on that individual basis. And I really think that is the heart of a lot of what I talk about here. I am kind of maybe I suppose about part of me being such a peacenik on so many fronts, but I really think that is the heart of what I get at with playing with loyalty the way I do throughout this whole thing. And you can kind of see it in what I put Anders through. It's not necessarily the journey of him gaining like this whole broad spectrum understanding of the Southern Black experience, but learning to connect with these people and realizing a kind of what he can do for them on the ground and b what he can do for himself on the ground that isn't just running into someone's bayonet. And again, sane, I don't know, call it a partisan tract for staying sane and alive.
I think that provides just an excellent perspective of what you've done there, and I applaud you for it because I think that's very important, especially considering the context of what everyone in America is going through today. Well, Denard, congratulations on How to Dodge a Cannonball, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It has been a great time here. I really appreciate you having me. These were great questions. I was very happy to talk about the book, and I hope it has a appeal to everyone out there.